Hey guys! Alright, today we're going to be watching 5 worst combat roles from history by Unknown5. Huh. To be honest, I don't really have a prediction for this. I don't quite, I mean, World War II is obviously going to be up here probably, but, what they mean by combat roles, it kind of changes the risk over time as technology advances. Is it gonna be like uh D-Day D-Day paratrooper, uh or something like that, because a D-Day paratrooper is gonna be completely different than a modern day paratrooper. Um so yeah. Let's go ahead and start watching.
War is hell,
Holy
but
shit,
throughout
that's
history
loud.
there have been certain combat roles which were especially dangerous, terrifying, or just plain disturbing. So just in case you thought that the odds of surviving a battle weren't bad enough, here are 5 combat roles from history which show that things could always be worse. Number
Ooh, I didn't
5.
think
The
about
Tunnel Rats.
Vietnam.
During the War for Independence against France, Vietnamese forces began digging deep underground tunnels to serve as escape routes and hiding places. However, against the better supplied and technologically superior American forces during the Vietnam War, the Viet Cong expanded the network of tunnels, which eventually grew to an intricate labyrinth of chambers, winding passageways, and bunkers which spread for thousands of miles.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Viet Cong forces would emerge from the underground fortresses to launch lightning-fast hit-and-run raids before melting away to the relative safety of the tunnels before the might of the American war machine could be turned against them. Knowing that they stood little chance against the US forces on the open ground, these kind of guerrilla raids became the Viet Cong's favoured strategy. The incredible network of tunnels connected villages that were miles apart and even linked different provinces, enabling forces to move between locations unseen and protected underground.
Are those tunnels still like good? Like you can still use them? I'm curious about that. That's what I'd like to know.
Safe from the intense bombing carried out by the US Air Force on the surface. Yet these tunnels were not only a place to hide or move around unseen, they were also used to store weapons, supplies, and food, and in many places even had air, sanitation, and cooking facilities, along with hospitals, print shops, and stages for political theatre. Thousands of soldiers spent several years living in the underground tunnels, only emerging from the darkness to conduct combat missions.
Oh my god.
To combat this threat, the US Army tried flooding the tunnels, or using gas to kill or flush out those sheltering within.
Gas? That's a war crime.
However, the sheer size of the tunnels
Those, I think, probably... I don't know if intentionally flooding a tunnel would be a war crime or not. I think it might be. But I think using gas is definitely a war crime.
With ingenious but simple water locks, meant that these attempts had little success. The tunnels were spread over several levels, with each level separated by a watertight trapdoor, which would protect lower levels against gas and flooding, and different sections of each level would be sealed off by downward U-bends in the tunnel, which would be filled with water, preventing gas from spreading to the rest of the level. The army even tried sending attack dogs into the tunnels to kill the Viet Cong soldiers. However, the dogs were quickly destroyed by the numerous traps lining the tight passageways.
Oh no!
It was decided that the only way to destroy the tunnels and chambers was to send in specialized soldiers to clear them out and blow them up one by one. The Tunnel Rats were born. Consisting of soldiers from the US, Australia, and New Zealand, the Tunnel Rats were usually volunteers who were tasked with descending into the tunnels to kill or capture Viet Cong soldiers, retrieve any intelligence, and destroy or disable the tunnels where possible. The men chosen needed to be small and thin to stand a better chance of making their way through the tight confines of the passageway, and all of them were highly skilled in hand-to-hand combat, a skill which they were expected to rely on regularly, as the limited space made larger weapons impractical. Upon discovering the camouflaged access holes which led to the tunnels, the Tunnel Rats would check the area for any booby traps before descending into the darkness below. The first man would be lowered in armed with just a pistol, bayonet, and flashlight, where he would search the immediate areas for traps before being joined by a second man. The man taking point would have the perilous task of moving forward in the darkness, usually with his flashlight off, so as not to alert enemy soldiers who may be lurking ahead of him. He had to be acutely aware of booby traps which would often line the tunnel,
God,
disarming
no.
them where possible, while the second man planned the tunnel's demolition. Every inch of the tunnel could prove deadly, with the Viet Cong's favoured traps including bamboo tubes containing poisonous snakes which were rigged to tripwires.
Ah! No! No!
And small holes in the tunnels which enemy soldiers hiding on the other side would plunge spears through, impaling the tunnel rat as he crawled past.
Yo, fuck that. No. Oh my god. Did he say people do this willingly? You'd have to force. This feels like something you'd have to force people to do.
The men's senses were constantly on alert, as they desperately strained to hear the sound of a man breathing ahead, smell his sweat, or see any movement which might indicate that death was near.
Oh my
It's hard to
God.
imagine the terror of being trapped in a dark, suffocating tunnel, knowing that anyone you might encounter in this hellish underworld would gladly kill you in an instant. In the heat and dirt, the men would crawl forward inch by inch, often covering hundreds of yards, prepared to fight for their life at every turn. Clearing the tunnel and setting the explosives could take anywhere from a few minutes to several hours, depending on the size of the complex and how much resistance the men met. However, to the tunnel rats, every minute felt like an eternity. Unsurprisingly, very few of the tunnel rats would survive the war, and each soldier knew that every trip into the subterranean labyrinth of tunnels and caverns was likely to be his last, yet still the men pressed on. Number 4. The Galley Rower. Before the advent of the steam engine, seafaring vessels had two options when it came to propulsion: the free but unreliable winds, or pure human brute force. Although sails could harness the power of the wind, a calm day would leave you drifting at the mercy of the sea, whereas human muscle could always be relied on in the form of galley rowers to propel your ship whatever the weather. Contrary to popular belief, ancient galley rowers tended not to be slaves, and were instead free men who were well respected for their profession. The work of the galley rower was skilled, and required high levels of training and coordination between each rower, and in battle the lives of all on board were reliant on the talents of the men rowing the galley. Therefore, ancient navies tended to shy away from placing their very survival in the hands of unskilled and unreliable slaves. Although the work was hard and conditions were tough, the job was an honourable one, and the men were well treated and respected by their countrymen. However, the life of the galley rower would change dramatically between the ancient world and the Middle Ages. By the early 16th century, the size of galley fleets and individual galleys was becoming much larger, meaning that far more rowers were needed to feed the ever-growing navies of Europe's nation-states. The supply of skilled oarsmen could not keep up with the demand, and with new technology and techniques reducing the skill required to perform the job, the grim era of the galley slave was born, as navies desperately scrambled to crew their galley fleets with whichever unfortunate souls they could seize. The practice became especially common in France, where the king ordered judges to sentence men to the galleys for their crimes, instead of issuing the death penalty. A minimum sentence of 10 years was issued to criminals found guilty of a variety of different crimes. However, such a sentence was usually considered to be as good as death, as men would be unlikely to survive the battles to come, or the terrible conditions they had to endure on the galleys. And even if they did survive, there was rarely anyone who would check or care to see when your sentence was complete, resulting in many galley rowers serving years longer than the term they had originally been given. In fact, the practice became so widespread that records indicate that as many as 60,000 men were sent to the galleys in France between the years 1680 and 1748. Although the men who were sentenced to serve as galley rowers had no doubt heard of the torment such a life might inflict, it's unlikely that they realised the full horror of what awaited them. Chained to the benches where they worked, the men were condemned to spend the majority of their short and miserable existence in the hellish confines of the rowing deck. Unable to wash or even go to the toilet, it was said that a galley could be smelt before it was even seen, the terrible stench carried on shore by the wind. Unable to move and chained to the benches, the rowers would often develop sores on their body, caused by the friction of the chains as they rowed, wounds that could easily become infected in the unsanitary conditions, resulting...
I didn't even think about that. With the chains, Shit.
in even more deaths.
Shit.
However, to the men in charge, the rowers were simply disposable tools, and there were always more criminals and captured enemy soldiers ready to replace them. Even if the men somehow managed to survive these terrible conditions, they still had to contend with the greatest danger of all, battle on the open seas. In the heat of battle, the men were not rowing for the victory of their side, but for their very survival. Chained down below, the ship and the men's fate were intertwined. Should the ship sink, the rowers would be pulled down with it to a watery grave.
Oh, yeah.
As such, keeping the men chained during combat acted as the greatest incentive possible, encouraging the men to row to the best of their ability, as victory was their only chance of survival. While it might seem as though capture by the enemy might be the galley slaves' best chance at freedom, the fate that awaited the men who survived battle but fell into enemy hands could be even worse. Barbary pirates operating out of bases across North Africa were especially feared enemies, and any galley slaves who fell into the pirates' hands would face a lifetime of slavery with no possibility of release. In fact, the entire Barbary coast was home to a thriving slaving industry between 1500 to 1800, and pirates operating out of North Africa terrorized Mediterranean coastal communities and merchant vessels, even going so far as to launch land-based raids in their quest to capture even greater numbers of people to be sold for profit, many of whom would end their days in the hellish conditions endured by so many thousands of galley slave rowers. Number 3. Flamethrower Operator.
Ooh.
The desire to set your enemy on fire is nothing new, and man has done his best to weaponize flame for thousands of years. As far back as the 1st century AD, Greek fire was deployed in a hand-pumped flamethrower-type weapon on board naval ships in an effort to give the Byzantines a combat advantage, and around 900 AD, the Chinese developed a piston-type flamethrower that used a substance similar to gasoline. Yet the modern flamethrower as we know it was first put to deadly effect during the First and Second World Wars. Designed to project a long stream of accurate flame, the weapon seemed like an ideal way to break the stalemate of trench warfare, either by incinerating enemy soldiers sheltering inside fortifications, or causing them to flee for their lives, where they could be gunned down while out in the open and exposed. During the Second World War, the weapon saw widespread use as a way to assault heavily defended positions.
And the reason it's dangerous is this thing on your back right there. Whoa.
Such as bunkers and pillboxes, where the soldiers sheltering inside could be burnt alive or flushed out by the intense flames, with the stream of flammable liquid able to bounce off walls and ceilings, thus reaching blind spots and hard-to-reach spaces. There truly was no hiding from the weapon, and the appearance of flamethrowers on the battlefield gave the side using them a distinct psychological advantage, as the enemy would be demoralized and terrified at the thought of the horrendous death that he might suffer. In the Pacific Campaign, flamethrowers were credited with saving Allied lives, as they enabled the deep caves and bunker complexes the Japanese were sheltering in to be cleared out from a distance, the deadly flames either burning alive the unfortunate men inside, or simply consuming all of the available oxygen, suffocating anyone left untouched by the fire. Yet the flamethrower operators didn't have things all their own way, and undertaking this role was a highly risky and stressful proposition. There were a variety of deadly risks associated with using flamethrowers in combat. The equipment itself was heavy and impaired mobility, making moving around a combat zone a slower and therefore more dangerous task. The weapon usually had a short burn time and used fuel quickly, meaning missing your target could leave you exposed to an enemy who might not take too kindly to the fact that you just tried to burn him alive. A fact which meant that the chances of you being taken prisoner alive were slim, and in many cases flamethrower operators were summarily executed by the opposite side. The weapon itself was highly visible, making its wielder a prime target for enemy fire, in particular from snipers, and should their bullets miss your body, they could very well hit the flammable liquid inside the weapon's tanks, causing you and friendly soldiers nearby to be engulfed in flames, suffering a horrific and fiery death at the hands of your own weapon. If this wasn't bad enough, the range of the weapon compared to rifles was relatively low, and to be effective the operator would need to get close to their target, further increasing the risk of being hit. Although the odds of flamethrower operators being engulfed in flames are not as high as Hollywood has led us to think, due to the fuel mixture being somewhat difficult to light with a bullet, the risk was still very much real, and was likely to be constantly haunting the man operating the flamethrower, causing him to be under a permanent state of stress.
True.
This mental stress would have likely been something that slowly ground the individual down, as each battle...
I really like how Unknown5 here is adding in the mental stress of it. He isn't just talking like, Statistically, people that had this role died a lot, or they were at greater risk of getting shot at. Right? He isn't just talking about those statistics. He's also bringing in and mentioning the mental toll that it takes, and I love it. I love
Was
that.
spent witnessing the terrible results of your handiwork, seeing men engulfed in flames, screaming in pain, and slowly dying, knowing that it was you who caused this suffering. The endless stream of charred bodies and the smell of burning human flesh undoubtedly had a huge psychological impact upon the Flamethrower Operator, and combined with the constant danger you were in, would have been enough to tip even a balanced individual over the edge.
Yeah.
With such risks associated with the use of the flamethrower, the weapons were soon phased out as many of the disadvantages could be removed by mounting the weapons on armoured vehicles, and since 1978 they have not been used in the US arsenal, and for good reason. A study of one Marine Corps flamethrower unit, which was deployed to Iwo Jima, found that the operators suffered a massive 92% casualty rate, with one military statistician estimating their average lifespan during the battle to be just 4 minutes. Number 2, U-Boat Crewman.
Oh, yes!
During both World Wars,
I forgot about
the German
U-boats.
U-boat operated as a highly feared and deadly killing machine that was skillfully used by its crew to launch attacks on unsuspecting Allied warships and merchant convoys which were supplying the British war effort. In fact, they were so effective that they came close to single-handedly turning the entire Second World War in the favour of Germany by nearly choking off desperate
No. They were effective. They did what they did. But they could not turn the tide of World War II. They could not.
desperately needed supplies coming into mainland Britain during the Battle of the Atlantic. The U-boat's reign of terror on the high seas was only brought to an end by the development of improved sonar locating devices and rapid advancements in anti-submarine warfare, which made finding the U-boats and destroying them a far more realistic strategy.
World War I, though. World War I, the U-boats definitely, probably could have stopped shipments entirely. Most could have probably done that sort of damage to Britain in World War I, but not World War II. Especially once the USA entered the war, there's no way that the Germans would be able, the U-boats would be able to cover enough territory effectively enough to halt American and British convoys.
The men selected to crew the U-boats were the cream of the crop, and the chosen few who made it through the rigorous screening process were generally intelligent and skilled young men who wore the uniform with great pride. However, it's unlikely that many of the young recruits knew the reality of the life which was awaiting them deep beneath the waves. Each patrol could last as long as 6 months, during which time crewmen were unable to bathe, shave, or even change their clothes due to the limited availability of fresh water. Despite a deodorant being provided, it's not hard to imagine the stench of the stale air, with dozens of unwashed men cramped together in a tiny confined space. With space so limited, the crew often had to resort to hot bunking, where as soon as a bunk became available, another man would crawl into the still warm bed to take his turn at attempting to get some rest. Privacy was a long-forgotten luxury, and the constant coming and going of crew meant that a restful sleep was nearly impossible to achieve. The claustrophobic confines of the vessel provided little opportunity for its crew to enjoy simple, everyday acts like stretching your legs or exercising, and the men would often go weeks without catching a glimpse of the sky, feeling the sun on their skin, or breathing in fresh air.
That is so demoralizing.
The day was split into 3 8-hour shifts, one for sleeping, one for regular duties, and one for miscellaneous tasks, yet the day provided little variety, and the work could be mind-numbingly monotonous. Fresh food supplies were quickly depleted, leading to a diet consisting of bland canned food that would be eaten every day for months. Yet these Spartan living conditions were simply minor annoyances when compared to the unending terror of life during combat missions and the prospect of a sordid and grisly death at sea. As the war dragged on and the Allies grew more adept at hunting down and destroying U-boats, the crewmen's chances of survival plummeted. In fact, some estimates put the casualty rates for U-boat crews as high as 75%, with average life expectancies as short as 3 months.
Not too bad.
As more and more of the boats failed to return from duty, the crews began to come to terms with the likelihood that they too would soon be entombed inside the vessel they lived and worked on, either drowning as seawater burst through the submarine's hull, burning up in a fiery explosion, or suffocating as the damaged vessel sank to the seabed. Either way, dying on board a U-boat was likely to be slow, painful, and terrifying. Yet just as bad as death itself was the constant fear of it that the men had to live with. Submerged for nearly 24 hours per day, for fear of being spotted by the enemy, the hunters had now become the hunted, as Allied forces relentlessly searched for any U-boats still lurking beneath the waves. The near-constant state of terror at the prospect of being discovered must have been mentally exhausting, and the entire world must have seemed as though it was out to get them, as heavily armed warships prowled the surface, while all around them was the unforgiving cold sea, waiting to burst in and drown them at any moment. It's likely that for many U-boat crewmen, the last thing they would have experienced was the sound of sonar pings, followed by the trail of exploding depth charges getting closer and closer, until finally the walls around them caved in, flooding the vessel with icy seawater and entombing the terrified men on the ocean floor for eternity. Number 1. The Penal Battalion. For as long as war
Penal Battalion, is this, like prisoners that are then forced into combat?
have been fought, criminals and other undesirables have been viewed as useful but disposable cannon fodder,
Aha.
men of little worth who will not be missed, and can therefore be
Right.
used to undertake dangerous missions or carry out unpleasant tasks that are beneath regular soldiers. Organised into penal battalions, these outfits of the damned faced a short life of misery and suffering, followed by an almost certain death on the front lines. During the days of the Roman Republic, legions consisting of criminals, slaves, and even those in financial debt were used against Hannibal's invading Carthaginian army. During
Really?
the Second Punic War,
Damn.
the condemned men promised freedom in exchange for victory as the Republic fought for its very survival. Centuries later, Napoleon would utilize penal units in combat as a
Really?
way to deal with disciplinary problems amongst his conscripted
I
soldiers,
did not know this.
with any man who refused to fight being sent to a punishment battalion where he would face harsh treatment and be disposed of in suicide attacks and other missions with low chances of survival. And with manpower shortages becoming an ever greater problem, during the later years of the Napoleonic Wars, even hardened criminals began being conscripted into the penal units as a way to bolster the army's fighting potential. Yet it's during the Second World War that penal battalions were most infamously used by both the German and Soviet armies, deployed into the meat grinder that was the Eastern Front on a truly staggering scale.
Ooh, yeah.
Prior to the war, the Germans had used soldiers who were deemed to be disruptive to general morale, but otherwise worthy of service, in specialised penal units. However, with the war turning against them, all types of prisoners, convicted soldiers, and even hardened criminals were conscripted into the ranks in a desperate bid to stave off defeat. Used to carry
I think they'd also use Slavic prisoners of war as well. I think they'd use Czechs. They'd conscript Czechs to fight. I'm not too sure how many Russians they forced to fight for them on the Western Front. But I think I've heard of it before.
carry out the most dangerous and backbreaking tasks, the doomed men were kept in line by officers and military police units, as well as the promise that should they serve with bravery, they might be allowed to return to regular army units.
Might be allowed.
In reality, they had little choice in the matter, for refusal to carry out their often suicidal missions would result in summary execution of their original sentence, which for those men on death row would mean a swift bullet to the back of the head or deadly encounter with the hangman's noose. Only by fighting on might they have a slither of a chance at surviving the war. Once the condemned men arrived at their designated units, they would be used and abused, given the most labour-intensive and dangerous tasks, which could involve clearing minefields, attacking heavily defended positions to soften up the enemy for the real soldiers waiting behind them, or being thrown into hopeless battles, used as cannon fodder to defend a chosen location where they would sacrifice their lives to buy just enough time for regular army units to escape before the position was overrun. In fact, the odds of survival for these missions were so bleak that they would often be referred to as Journey to Heaven missions, a black humour term which effectively describes how the men viewed the penal unit's chance of making it back alive. The combat records of these units seems to have been mixed. The desire to win back their freedoms and rights as citizens, coupled with the often hopeless situation they found themselves in, meant that the men were often willing to fight to the bitter end. However, when fighting anywhere other than the Eastern Front, the men tended to simply surrender at the first possible opportunity. Many of the units also had little prior military training, and although effective against unarmed civilians and poorly trained partisans, they stood little chance against veteran Red Army units. One of the most infamous of these units was the 36th Grenadier Division of the Waffen-SS. The unit was originally formed of convicted poachers who were selected for their ability as woodsmen and were used to hunt and kill partisans in occupied territories. Yet the unit soon grew, recruiting from prisons across the Reich in an effort to weaponize Germany's most dangerous and insane men, turning them loose on the conquered lands of the East. The unit quickly gained a reputation for extreme brutality towards civilians, falling under the command of Oskar Dirlewanger, a convicted child molester whose atrocities are said to have been so extreme that other SS commanders openly voiced their displeasure at his methods. Yet despite this example of truly hardened criminals being conscripted, the majority of the 50,000 men who were thought to have been deployed in penal units by the German army were simply petty criminals, soldiers who had displayed an unwillingness to fight, or simply those unfortunate enough to have been deemed undesirable for any number of reasons. However, this number is dwarfed by the estimated 430,000 men who were used in penal battalions by the Soviet army, where such units were arranged into a formidable yet disturbingly expendable force.
400,000.
In an effort to install discipline and halt the panicked retreats caused by the German offensive into the Soviet Union, Stalin issued the infamous Order No. 227 in July 1942, which would lead to a massive increase in the size of the Red Army's penal units. The order became widely known as the Not One Step Back Order, and effectively banned the use of retreat as a military tactic. From now on, anyone found to be retreating would face severe punishment, which could include on-the-spot execution. Many of the soldiers who ran afoul of this new directive found themselves shipped into the Red Army's penal battalions, with the first batch of disgraced officers demoted to the lowest rank and sent to meet German troops near the Volga River. Of 929 men sent into battle that day, only 300 would still be living 3 days later, giving a taste of the terrible losses these units would suffer in the coming years of war. The punishment was supposed to be temporary, where the disgraced soldier could redeem himself through heroic actions, or by suffering an injury in battle. However, in reality, this promise of redemption was usually just a lie told to ensure that the men did not enter open revolt. The men sent to the penal units had been earmarked for death one way or another, and were unlikely to survive the war. The NKVD secret police units who commanded the penal battalions viewed the men with disdain, as common cannon fodder to be expended in battle. Kept under armed guard, the units would be sent to where the fighting was fiercest, only given weapons at the very last moment, before being ordered to advance and attack. They would usually be sent against heavily defended German positions, where they would be used to wear down the enemy in an effort to enable regular army units to break through, or simply sent out in large groups to determine the enemy's location, strength, and capabilities via the resulting weapons fire and speed in which they were wiped out. There are even reports of them being dressed in dark uniforms instead of snow camouflage in an effort to draw enemy fire away from the regular Red Army units. Faced with such terrible odds, retreat might seem like the sensible approach. However, behind the penal units were soldiers known as barrier troops, which were specialized forces tasked with gunning down anyone running away from the fighting, leaving the doomed men with nowhere else to go but forwards into near certain death. Even if by some miracle they survived the encounter, there were always more battles to be fought, more missions to carry out. Unsurprisingly, penal battalions would often be wiped out to the last man in an attack, and very few of the nearly 500,000 men who served in such units are thought to have escaped the war with their lives. So those are my choices.
Huh. Ooh. I feel like So I'm gonna say that I think, in the sense of what is recorded history and the numbers that we do know, I do agree with this list. However, I do not think that this is, in terms of the whole of history, in terms of combat roles, I don't think these are probably the necessarily most deadliest or worst combat roles to get. I mean, they are certainly mentally draining. They are horrifyingly, they do a horrifying impact on your mentality. I'd also switch some of these around. I mean, I think the Penal Battalions probably should get number one, but like the U-boats, I'd probably put the Flamethrower people at number two, because, as I said, they had a 90% chance of death, and they also had to live with hearing the screams of those that they burned. That's terrifying. While the U-boats, yeah, they had what, 70% chance? They had a chance to live. Their average was 3 months. The average flamethrower dude was 4 minutes in battle. So, looking at it that way, I feel like the flamethrower should be placed higher. But yeah, this was a good video. I like Unknown5. Neat little factoids he makes. I have nothing else to add. I hope you guys enjoyed. Remember to hit that like button and subscribe for more. Leave a suggestion down below for what you want to see me react to next. I'll see you guys in the next video. Thank you.